Good afternoon, I'm George Jones. Here we have our panel. We've been reflecting on what it is we're talking about. I think it's about Iain's book, and particularly about Hackney, where it's set. Now, I don't live in Hackney. I live in Islington. To me, Iain...
Hackney's East Islington.
Yes. To me, Iain captures my attitude to Hackney. Hackney, after all, is one of London's twilight zones, neither fish nor fowl. It's not North London, neither is it the East. It's by no means easy to get to. It has no tube, is poorly served by buses, and its railway stations are on lines that link only to the hubs of other twilight zones. Indeed, when you think of, well, when I think of Hackney, I have no sense of there being a there. It's a place without a there. And I wonder if there is anything now in Hackney. Why would anyone ever want to go to Hackney? What do we think of Hackney? The marshes, the Hackney carriages, the Hackney Empire. I live in North Islington and walk down. I came here today, I'm sure, following the track of the mysterious lost Hackney Brook, which runs from what's called South Highgate, Archway, Upper Holloway to anybody else, to Hackney. So I feel that I'm in contact with those underground forces that are so much a part of Iain's book. Iain lived in Hackney, as I understand it, for 40 years, and it's about 40 years that this book covers. Now, there is a history to Hackney before Iain went there. And that, I hope, is where Jerry comes in, because Jerry Wright, very distinguished historian, has written two books about the history of London in the 20th century and in the 19th century. And Hackney appears in there. And also Jerry was a local government officer. In fact, he was the chief executive for some time of Hackney. And that was the capacity in which I first met Jerry, when he was chief executive, and I went to see him, talk to him about governing Hackney, which always seemed an impossible task. I think it may have defeated Jerry, as it has defeated so many others. And on my visit, I paid a visit at the back of the town hall to the array of previous dignitaries, including my great hero Herbert Morrison, because that was the cause of my very first visit to Hackney in the 1960s, when I was writing a biography of Herbert Morrison. And Herbert Morrison learned his trade as a politician in Hackney, in the town hall. He was a Labour mayor of Hackney in the 1920s, and that's where he learned how to be a skilled politician, and above all, how to handle officers. And from the perspective of officers, civil servants afterwards, Morrison was always regarded as a model professional politician. So Morrison learned something important from Hackney. But I do fear that the image I have of Hackney politics, and it comes out very well in Iain's book, is that it's a place of warring sects, loony lefties, always rowing with each other, a sort of place of a perpetual undergraduate evening inn. Well, that's my picture of Hackney. Also, my final image to get over to you as I see it of Hackney, which I think is in tune with some of the themes of Iain's book, is that the past is always there under the surface. If you go there and look at the now, I don't think, frankly, there's much to see. Or would you go to Hackney unless you had to? Clissold Park. Now, I recommend that if you've got children. That was always a super park with animals, with a marvellous set of play equipment. I can see the sense of going to look at Clissold Park. Victoria Park, that was something different. That was forbidding. I got the impression they didn't really welcome people to it. Now, Patrick, our other speaker, has also written of parts of Hackney. And I think I get from both of them that this is a rather formless place. Kaleidoscopic reality. That's a picture I have. I think it's a place you only go to because it was once important. There are parts of Hackney that were locations for important events or important buildings. And that's why anybody would want to go to Hackney. Well, I think I've said enough. I'm now going to... I could talk, of course, about civic corruption and civic neglect, but I think we'll turn to Iain, and Iain, let it go.
Right. Can I don't know if this is active. No, probably isn't. But I just like the thing of preaching when you've got a captive audience. Nice that you mentioned Clissold Park and with such great affection. It was a very popular place for someone called Astrid Prohl, who was one of the Bader Meinhof group, who Hackney decided to sponsor when she was on the run by giving her a job as a gardener. So she was in Clissold Park. This was before she was trained as a motor mechanic and given the job of teaching young black offenders how to strip down motor cars, which is where she made her fatal mistake of storming into the local police station to complain about the way they were treating these young black offenders and getting herself arrested because they were bright enough to notice her from a wanted poster. That's very much the nature of Hackney. But since we're here, I believe this is London School of Economics, I think we should think about economics too and come in from that side. It's not something I know anything about, but the whole idea of the kind of money metaphor as a description of the world has completely disappeared and gone. We're in another ball game altogether. The fact that actually we're not being paid to be here today, makes it very strange. Why on earth would someone get up who isn't being paid? Either it's an excess of vanity or promotion, or else it's much closer related to people who get up at Hyde Park. They're going to bark at you, say strange things, and there is some compulsion to speak in tongues. A week ago today, I was on a very, very strange excursion, which is very true to contemporary Hackney. It's a bit like Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities. What was happening was a routemaster bus, about which everybody feels very affectionate, was chartered to run from the north of the borough, Finsbury Park, which is the boundary, across to London Fields, where there's an artist's studio, and finally out to Hackney Wick. This is a trajectory right across the whole boundary of the place. And movement is part of what Hackney is about, the strange conjunctions. It's an enormous borough. It's kind of elastic waisted that takes in parts of the wealth of the city and areas of enormous poverty and deprivation and wildernesses at the edge on the River Lee side, apparently. Well, we get on this bus, and of course, drinks are provided on the bus, and the whole sense is of this slightly insane journey where Hackney becomes an artwork, which is always one way of looking at it. And the people on the bus don't know where they are. As George said, there is no there for them to see. They stop at the first studio in London Fields, and of course there's blue and white police tape up because there are police cars, there's a guy lying in the road, there's a classic Hackney incident, but they kind of not sure if this is an artwork I've arranged or not. They pass through their various savage dogs, but some of them are represented in the paintings of Jock McFadden, and they kind of relax because it's a studio and it all picks up. But as this Routemaster bus moves down through Hackney, at the back of Ridley Road and so on, the natives who don't understand this concept that this is all ironic and in inverted commas actually try to get on the bus. Because they're really affectionate about Routemaster buses, which are no longer there. They don't like the kind of bendy buses and all that. So they're trying to get on this bus, and the woman standing is trying to explain this is not a real bus. Well, it looks like a real bus. You know, these are the kind of buses that we absolutely love. And finally, as night is beginning to settle in, they're getting a bit nervous. I actually get them to the blue fence, the borderline. This is where the city really divides into two different things. And you've got this series of warehouses that look over an absolute sea of mud like an invaded city where the lorries are rolling day and night into this space. The grinding machinery is there, and the there-ness has been sucked out of this landscape around Stratford, where I once, in fact, worked in a container loading yard, but that's another story. Anyway, we go into this yard, and it's the perfect landscape because at the back is a wilderness island on the edge of the development zone, which has no longer got any function to be developed. And one of those, rather like this, kind of this wooden cladding is very, very key on the new buildings. Has gone up. Overnight has appeared this building like a ghost ship, clad in bits of teak, unoccupied, and in front of it, the walls are absolutely covered with incredible graffiti, like Mexico City, like wonderful crocodiles and skulls exploding and all the rest of it, and an enormous skip, and everybody, of course, has their digital cameras flashing away. And out of the skip crawls a figure. He's actually been sleeping in there. Another one has been collecting odd shoes to make another artwork. And we go up, and they're very nervous about having these people in there because somebody's overdosed and the sirens are going. So the kind of reality, the fiction, and the thing that's trying to be presented creates an extraordinary universe that people haven't really appreciated. The thing that's not seen. They don't know what's happening because the second life, the kind of notion of the computer-generated reality is overwhelming. The real battle that goes on out there is as these fences, these enclosures that occur, what happens is the fences themselves are covered like a blue screen in television with a sort of form of imagery which has no relation to any kind of life. There are like Scientologists or Mormons with grinning faces in front of gleaming, immaculate stadia which will actually never be built in some cases. An enormous parkland is created in virtual imagery. And that's pumped out all the time so that actually people believe this is the truth. You say, do you know what actually happened here? No, they don't. They've no notion of the backstory. So this has really put some pressure on the people who live there in a kind of permitted wilderness, a zone between zones. They have to come up with some alternative version of this, which has sent them back to doing incredible things on walls, to making artworks in the kind of the spirit of the last days, knowing that if they look out of their window, everything is vanishing. One of the most remarkable spaces in the whole thing was a series of allotments given 100 years ago on land that was part of the Hackney Marshes in perpetuity. And a community developed there, initially very energized by those who'd survived the Second War, particularly a group of old submariners, started to build these huts. Out of the rubbish, they scavenged out of this landscape. And more recent times, Kurdish mountain people were living there next to quite fancy restaurateurs from Islington. All of them, this whole community, which ticked every box of what the Olympics were supposedly about. They were recovering the soil, they were growing, and they'd created a series of individual communities. And there's a filmmaker called Emily Richardson who did live in Hackney, and who's made a wonderful record of these particular buildings, which she's showing at the moment in a gallery called the Danielle Arnaud Gallery in Kennington Road, 123 Kennington Road. Worth checking out, because it's kind of heartbreaking to see this. Because what happened was unfortunately, it sat on what would become the perimeter fence of the Olympics, so it had to go. And it's been, the people there were removed and all of that's obliterated, and they were put onto another site, which is the bleakest thing I've ever seen, on a corner of Hackney Marshes, next to a motorway. The ground is flooded. It's going to cost £500,000 to rescue it. And the huts built for them are like a series of chicken coops. and most of them gave up. Some of them have carried on, and they haven't grown a single thing in the period that they've been expelled. This is a kind of classic. We can quantify what's lost. We can't describe what's still there. Hackney itself, the journey is of increasing difficulty because the nature of it is to impose not only this virtual reality, but a kind of savage form of geometry. They love the idea of squares. Everything has to be Gillette square, or a quarter. Patrick and I in earlier life visited somewhere called the Bow Quarter, which actually was the old match factory where the match girl strike took place and was reinvented in that kind of Thatcherite boom into something that was called a quarter. As long as you can get the fraction into it, it's okay. Or else you call yourself a village. If you, once you want to detach yourself from Hackney, but you're in Hackney, you will call yourself Mapledene Village, which is where the Blairs conveniently located to for the early Thatcher years before moving on, like our chairman, to Islington, better climes. They didn't really realise what the story was in Hackney. The way to negotiate the streets becomes more and more difficult because you're importing a kind of suburbia where the Holly Street estate, this wonderful zone of tower blocks that went up. When I moved there in 1969, the terrace where I lived was condemned. It was being pulled down to put up the tower blocks, which are part of this sort of Corbusier experiment, which then ran out of puff at that point. And when those came down, estate after estate after estate went into Holly Street. But they were sort of disasters in lots of different ways. The main thing about the original estate was that it was a perfect environment for cockroaches. They had an expert down from Cambridge who says there's nowhere better in the whole world for breeding cockroaches. You've got an enormous generating of heat. You've got enormous gaps between the stone and the floorboards, and you've got hollow doors, and cockroaches love it. And one woman cooked a chicken in a microwave and banged it down on a table with a film crew, and the chicken exploded and just 1 million cockroaches rushed out. So in that sense, all of this area is very peculiar. And now the take on it is that it's okay because we're going to cover it with CCTV. And a young researcher from Cambridge who was doing a project on actually how valuable is CCTV came to see me and discovered that Hackney Council have this enormous bunker in Stoke Newington with 60 or more, and growing all the time, surveillance screens whereby the whole of the area turns into a kind of movie. It's the same philosophy I was talking about before. And what you do is you watch it, but you don't intervene. So everything is logged, but nothing is actually done. And this guy, I interviewed him because one of the methods I use in this book is just to let people tell long monologues of what they discovered. He said, in the Stoke Newington surveillance room, they were saying, we'll have a camera on every street corner in Hackney. Their view is, if it can be proved that this technology displaces crime, we must put cameras everywhere. So there are no dark places in the city, and then the problem is solved. It goes back to what my guide was saying about CCTV cutting into the budget of the library services. None of the money for this operation comes from central government. It all comes from Hackney Council tax. The Home Office in the 1990s put up a lot of money for council CCTV schemes. 78% of the crime prevention budget goes on CCTV. They then commission a report. At the end of the 1990s, they concluded CCTV actually does very little to reduce overall crime statistics. If you put CCTV on Holly Street, it will reduce crime, but in national terms, it doesn't have any effect. They said, our money has been completely wasted. Government is now encouraging other people to initiate CCTV schemes, but they're not offering financial support. I asked the Hackney CCTV watchers how they stop criminal behaviour. All the entire operation amounts to, I discovered, is just to collect evidence of various Met operations going on at the time. The Met officers are constantly swanning in and out of the Hackney Control Centre. They say, can we get video footage of such and such a location? Hackney Council taxpayers are essentially writing a blank cheque to provide resources for the Metropolitan Police. The other major activity in the Stoke Newington CCTV room is the storage of automatic number plate recognition software. The boundary of Hackney is policed by a surveillance ring fence. It's one of the only boroughs that has this automatic recognition facility. They bought it from Northern Ireland, from Special Branch. Every car that enters Hackney has its number plate scanned. And what this has achieved, the operatives told me, is to cause drug dealers and others with stolen vehicles to stay within the borough. It's a self-imposed tagging scheme. As soon as a car crosses into Islington, it goes off screen. So you're okay with Islington again. The tragedy of this, of course, was that the CCTV came in to cover the whole of the Holly Street estate, and there was another of these squares called Evergreen Square. My God. Bristling with cameras, and so the local characters who used to hang out on the square doing whatever they did found that they couldn't be there any longer because they were being registered. So they actually started to break into the buildings, into the stairwells where there were no cameras. And a guy who was studying, working, who'd actually got a place in Cambridge as a mathematician, had come to England as a refugee, came down the stairs to complain about this stuff that was going on and was stabbed and killed. So that in that case, the fact that the watching was going on actually led to his death. And there is this Orwellian sense that the watching continues in that now council groups have been provided with cameras to follow people around places like London Fields and catch them dropping litter. So if you drop litter, you can be filmed and fined. But once you get it into your head that the notion is to film and watch, it's hard to define when someone's dropping litter or just having a conversation or whatever it is. The whole way of thinking is extremely strange and bizarre. If you managed to negotiate this set of places, you would land on Dalston Lane, which is the territory that Patrick famously wrote about in Journey Through Ruins. It wasn't that long ago, but it seems like a totally different era. Because Dalston Lane, I was talking to Jerry about this, has vanished. I met Jerry, and originally I didn't realise he had this elevated position with Hackney Council because he was a customer of my bookstall. I had a second-hand bookstore in Islington. And Jerry used to come and buy the sort of lost books of London history, fiction or non-fiction, and build up a very interesting bibliography. And Patrick I met because he was writing a piece about my first book, and he'd moved into the area where I was living. And we discovered this kind of shared passion for wandering the city, doing that kind of strange picking up of trifles research, finding odd little stories. And Patrick discovered that actually you could tease a whole book out of one small street that stood there with a mixture of Georgian terraces, a strange club, a black club as it was then, called the Four Aces, which had once upon a time been a Victorian circus, which then became a state-of-the-art electric cinema in the 1920s, black club to finally a Labyrinth, which was a club of the rave era, the ecstasy era, and then squatted and then disappeared from the map. It was obliterated as part of a massive development to put in a railway. The strange thing was, when I moved in 1969, there was a railway. It ran from this very spot down to the city, to Broadgate, and you could travel into the city. It was part of that pattern of Hackney belonging to the Victorian clerks. Clerks of the city had their houses in Hackney. They could very easily move on a train up to here. That train service was still in place. It was very popular. It was taken out because apparently it wasn't popular. The real reason it was taken out was because of the Broadgate development, to create this kind of fake New York, ersatz New York, with skating rinks and all the rest that is now the city. But of course, because of the Olympic development, we need this transport hub to get people to the sports day for a fortnight. So it becomes inevitable that you have to put the railway back in. So having gone, it's now restored. It's not going to go down to the same place anymore. And to pay for it, you've got to put up a huge, monolithic, 20-story development by Barrett's, who have unfortunately just declared a loss of £250 million and won't be able to complete on this. So you've got this monstrous thing, which also rewrites the geometry of the city, which is what I was talking about, because pavements disappear, you can't move, those kind of liberties are gone. The Ridley Road Market, which was the centre of anarchy and spirit and community, has to be cleared away by bureaucratic pestilence from above to create a huge shopping mall to develop a thing they call pedestrian permeability, which is that you come out of the station and you walk through a particular tunnel that only gives you access to the shopping mall. And to do that, you've got to blast a tunnel through the middle of a wonderful Art Deco building that's sitting there in a cafe. So these strange senses of geometry are there. It's slightly oppressive, and I'll just finish by a brief extract from an interview with a guy called Bill Parry Davis, who's a solicitor on Dalston Lane, who's watched this development, this area of Patrick's very closely. They want a new big bus station on the theatre side on a huge concrete slab over the railway cutting. The slab cost £39 million. How is that slab going to be paid for? We'll get planning permission to build a 20-storey tower block right here. We'll get Hackney to give us half the value of the site along with planning permission. And all this activity, all this destruction is to pay for a naked slab so the TfL can pass their buses and have a transport interchange. You have to build high to achieve a small footprint. They say the bus station is a strategic requirement for the Olympics. Nothing must stand in its way. So you have to invent a method for getting clients from this new station to Dalston Kingsland further up the road. You try walking there now. You can't move. You can't breathe in the crush. What is inevitable is more demolition. The Crown and Castle pub on the corner, they're knocking it down. The finest building in the junction. The forces are huge. This is a multi-million-pound development, a £200 million development. The Olympics have made everything much worse. Now all the forces of government are working towards the one strategic objective. They have immense powers, the GLA, the TfL, the Hackney Council. They offer up a gesture of public consultation, but the consultations are sham, it's a waste of time, a lot of the work goes into opposing their proposals. It was a done deal, a hard lesson to learn. Look outside, the site is flat, it's rubble, it's like a return to the first age of the railways. It's the total destruction that follows any major change in the transport infrastructure. The council architect said, we're reinstating the historic urban grid. This used to be a line of houses down Rosebery Place, and so there were. They were 2-storey houses with front and back gardens. Now there will be a 20-storey block with no gardens. That's what you mean, reinstating the grid. That's just bullshit. That's architectural bullshit. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. We now have Patrick Wright, who's also, as we hear, a resident of Hackney, written about Hackney, and my notes tell me he has written a number of highly acclaimed and sometimes also reviled books, including The Village That Died for England, Tank, The Progress of a Monstrous War Machine, A Journey Through Ruins. And he's an extensive broadcaster, filmmaker, and we're going to have some visual aids. Patrick Wright.
But we're going to start off in East Berlin, because we're talking about Hackney. I was thinking about, I had a conversation yesterday about this text. I think one of the most interesting political writers of the late 20th century, or maybe the mid-20th century, is a German called Uwe Jonsson, who was known as the novelist of the divided Germany, who did us all the great favour in a sense, and we didn't know this at the time, but he moved to Sheerness and drank himself to death in the early 80s. I mean, he just gave up on German politics. But in the late 50s, he was living in Berlin, the city was divided, and the wall hadn't been built. And he was writing a novel, and he had a problem which I think I can relate to Hackney in a rather oblique way. He opens this rather wonderful essay, which was published in the Evergreen Review in 1961, by saying, I would like to discuss some of the difficulties I encountered in describing a Berlin interurban station. At this time, the subway systems, the trams were connected. You could still travel from eastern to western Berlin. A man, one among many, steps out of a train that has just pulled in, crosses the platform, heads towards the street exit. An everyday occurrence with slight variations I saw, or rather I watched this endlessly, so I thought I might write about it. The novel I was working on needed something to interrupt its flow. I wanted 4 connected sentences as a kind of bulk to stand out from the rest, to suggest a pause. A man getting off a train seemed to serve this purpose, but it didn't fit into either 1 long or 4 short sentences. So I substituted another incident that produced the same effect. After a while, it annoyed me that this simple scene in the station refused to symbolize Berlin, and I tried to make a whole story of it, to describe just that problem. That's when I ran into difficulties. Now, what Johnson is saying there is that in a divided city there is no single reality, and therefore there are slants. There are these very divided ideological takes on the world, constantly opposed, constantly policing everything. Depending upon where you are or how you stand in relation to this division, even the simplest fact looks different. So a man walking out of a railway station can't be used except in a cod please the public novel as a sort of romance. You can't use it in a novel in a way that assumes it has a grounded reality. And I think as we think about what sort of writing can come out of a place like East London in our time, that's a very good example to remember, that problem, that fundamental problem of how we deal with the idea of the real in a place that constantly runs off with any nail anybody tries to hammer it down with. And I'm just going to make a few points about that. First off, it seems to me that East London and Hackney, but all of East London, consists in a way of a modest, hard-pressed reality that is endlessly engulfed by a storm of received or imported symbolism. And that play between the modesty of what is actually happening on the ground and the florid nature of the interpretations people impose on it is a really important issue for anybody trying to get to a grip on this place. You can start with the Victorian imagery of the abyss, Jack the Ripper, the Elephant Man. You can move straight in, as I did when I was writing Journey Through Ruins into the 80s, with this welfare of this imagery of the welfare state as a monstrous thing. The council estate, the high-rise tower block being used as an emblem of what the geographer Ruth Glass once called, she invented the word gentrification incident in the 60s. She once talked about the image of the high-rise being used to sort of symbolize what she called the zombies of the welfare state. In other words, people who lived in it were zombified by this symbol that was attached to them. You can take this on in lots of different ways. When I was in Hackney, I don't live there anymore, but when I did live there, there was this wonderful contrary rhetoric as well that was equally extravagant in its use of language against place. The council couldn't run anything, but it was putting up nuclear-free zone signs. The libraries their windows were ablaze with posters promising revolution in 3 corners of the world, 4 corners of the world, and there was a notice on the door saying closed due to shortage of staff. So that sense of rhetoric was not only a kind of traditional sort of monstrous making imagery, it was also these political contrary claims. Second point, which is absolutely crucial, which is perhaps shared with Berlin, although very differently, is that there is no uniformity of view that is possible in a decent city in the 20th century. There may be no there in Hackney, but there sure are a lot of heres. There are people there from all over the world. There are perspectives that are completely mixed, completely rich, completely confused in their sort of prolixity. So a city is not the city is not a place of single views. Instead, we're dealing with radically different views, often opposed views, cultures, and prospects. And I believe the big challenge of the city for the writer is the same in this respect as it is for the administrator or the civil servant or whoever, is how do you express the collectivity of this place? My own view is that the old collectivist ideas are not adequate. We've seen the problems with them. The managerialist ideas that are being used now to re-rip the place are equally neglectful of the attending to the people. And I think the best model that history provides is the model of the common. I know we're talking about a city, and commons are normally thought about as rural places, but the great thing about a common is rights of common is traditionally they allow for different people to make use of a public domain, or even a semi-public domain, from very different points of view. So you know as you use it that other people use it differently. In other words, you have rights to put animals there, somebody else has rights to pick up kindling or whatever it is. So the rights of common are about a form of mutual use of a public domain which doesn't insist on melting everybody down into some crapulous idea of what their identity of their interest is. The third general point that a writer dealing with East London has to face is the dereliction of politics, both national and local. Hackney has spent many parts of the post-war period, I don't know what Morrison was up to, but for many years, when I was there certainly in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it was effectively a failed state. And that is the only, let's be honest about this. And what we've had is, I mean, when I lived there, every dust cart was a parrot ship. You know, these guys, I mean, good luck to them. They'd privatised them before Thatcher came up with privatisation. They were driving around. You had to pay them off to get them to pick anything up. You know, there are all sorts of ridiculous deals like this. We've known the housing estates were cockroach breeding farms. I mean, you know, there are endless examples of this. The housing department, I remember visiting it, it was like going to a crack house in the Bronx. It was armoured. You couldn't get in. You know, I mean, there were these poor officials hiding from the enraged populace. The council chamber was quite often like that as well. So this is the first point. Now, I'm not making too cheap points about the council, although I think they deserve it. But I do think that, you know, basically we have a major problem about how we politically articulate these parts of the city. And it seems to me that this story that Iain tells us about surveillance is completely part of this. What we now have is a situation where all politics has gone derelict and we have managerialism in its place. And managerialism is really an issue. And it's expressed in this introduction of surveillance. It's expressed in the way planning is operating in relationship to places of complexity. It's expressed, I think, particularly in the way a kind of green vocabulary is being used with an absolute lack of democratic attachment. As long as you've got bloody nesting room for nightjars on that new building in Dalston Lane, you can get away with wrecking the place. Yeah? I mean, I'm serious. There's a real problem about the way green rhetoric has been used to just sort of replace democratic politics. Now then, what kind of writing? Just a few points here. First of all, I don't think you can write in a way that is single-voiced or even simply descriptive within a place as complex as the city. I think Hackney is a wonderful place to write about for these very reasons, because it's challenging, it's difficult. You can't run a simple description over it. So I also believe that you can't operate as the kind of chief executive of your own perceptions. You can't. You can't sort of operate on, I mean, I think the idea of a survey is problematic. The idea of the kind of survey that the London School of Economics is associated in, where you go into these places and you sort of map the sociology and come up with general conclusions. The truth of the matter is that people live in very different worlds, and one has to find a way of engaging that if you're writing about a place of the sort of thought that happens. You've got to be very careful also not to use the imagery of the abyss in a way that simply reaffirms it. You know, I mean, there was a wonderful, interesting book in the early 80s called Inside the Inner City by Paul Harrison, a man I deeply respect, who went to Hackney and produced a book that revealed it to be the worst place in the world. And he was playing on the imagery of the abyss, supposedly in order to embarrass Margaret Thatcher and her government into changing their politics. But my suspicion is that it only succeeded in playing on the imagery of the abyss, to be honest. Second, so thriving on chaos is a temptation that should be avoided. Thriving on chaos is a phrase from a management bullshit, I thought Iain describes, but it is, in a sense, part of what psychogeography has become, this sense of, a lot of the art of the East End is to do with celebrating disruption and chaos and dirt and filth, and, you know, I mean, I think we have to be careful about that, although I'm not suggesting we deny the condition. You know, a writer doesn't only have to rival the Hackney Gazette on its bad days, in other words. And I also think one needs to use exploration, one needs to use analysis, one needs to, you know, you can't, I think, write about Hackney without digging into the background. So for me, this street, I'm going to end very quickly. I'll just show you these pictures because this is the piece of Dalston Lane. My experience when I was doing Journey Through Ruins was I didn't know how to unify this book and all these investigations I'd made into various aspects of post-war culture and how, you know, the history of the welfare state was expressed in Hackney's pleasures and agonies. So I just found this bit of street, which was Dalston Lane. All it was a bit that I walked up every day with the rust. And it's a 300 to 400 yard stretch. And it's, of course, a place that looks absolutely crap. I mean, from every standard and second point of view. It's always, you know, I remember Peter Boston, one of the many government ministers who's been responsible for improving the area, so-called, said, I don't know why people are complaining about my plan to demolish it all and build a road. After all, the spine of the development goes to the worst bit in the area. In other words, there's nothing. The more you demolish, the more healthy you are. So just carrying on, these are pictures taken in 1991 by Andrew Holmes, an architect who went down this little stretch of street that I've written about a year or so after my book was done. And he just picked up these little images, and you can see this kind of energy around the place. What happened to me was, as I was, this is a bit that's been demolished to go underneath the new railway station and slab of flats. But basically what I found was, as you looked at Dalston Lane, it's sort of, as you researched it, as you talked to people, it became more and more magnificent. You know, I mean, I got to the point where I saw the bus queue as the culmination of world history. People from all over the world now. And they're sort of relating to one another in this beautifully, informally choreographed way, which has a bit to do with terror, a bit to believe it or not, somebody's going to buy that. There's a street where people still mend things, where you can buy fourth-time used restaurant equipment and open a kind of here's a guy this is a Kurdish guy. He's actually using the streets. He's using it as a dead street, which is kind of the cars are whizzing by, and he's out there doing what he wants to do. There used to be this does survive. It's on the north side, early Victorian. There was a wonderful, slightly distressed psychotic lady who used to, behind those trees is a parapet on top of that building, and she used to often be seen with, sometimes with absolutely no clothes on, holding a board of chess and a chess set. And she used to go down, she used to walk down the top of the roof to climb in the window of a friend's place to play chess. I'm not joking. These are sort of, it was obviously a sad case. I mean, it was a woman who was unwell, but murals. I mean, this is stuff that is. I just give you this, but it's emblematic, I think, of the city that we can't get our management planning framework around. You are here. This is the Balls Pond Town Guide Cabinet when I started that book, which is basically put there by Blackpool speculators. You see these on postal resorts. You see these at Blackpool. So come to the pleasure beach, press the bell, and you see the cinema. Here it's all LCC and HBC flats and advertiser spotlights. I mean, this is where this was at Dalston Junction. This got ripped out a long time ago and replaced with the usual York stone and the rest of it. But there were these kind of informal objects that were still there because nobody had done the place over. Time was scattered around in fragments in Dalston, and every shop was training over different decades. And I mean, here's the Holly Street, and then you had this wonderful revolutionary stuff going on the walls. I mean, here's a revolution in Turkey. This is to do with the Turkish Communist Party stuck onto these sort of adverts. So this sort of succession of billboards, and when the market's buoyant, billboards move fast. When it gets depressed, they sort of stay in paper lots and peels and all falls to pieces. But what I'm doing here, here's a funeral place that is, people used to say wonderful things about London East End funeral culture. That it's baroque, like dark colours of purple. There was one still operating. You did have to do that. Yeah, no, I'm not going to say much more. I'm looking at one particular image. This guy was still fixing Betamax video recordings. But I just think this is a self-painted. I love this image. It's a self-painted West Indian travel image. Somebody got out there and painted that. So it was up in Wolfson Road for years. And it was New Modern Flying Paradise. I'm still not quite at the image I want to land with. It'll come, I hope. Sorry, I didn't order these. Yeah, this is a guy who's this is Rupie Edwards who brought Brady to England, and he still sells to this day. It's still there in many of those markets and CDs. Yeah, this doesn't matter. That is the picture I want to show you. If you're from Kurdistan and you can have a barbecue in the street, why not use your car as a sword? I mean, that's a very good Hackney. I'll stop with that. But I mean, all I'm really saying is that this is what we failed to understand. We failed to find a way of valuing this sort of experience about places like East London. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. You said how difficult it is for a single author to encapsulate and get a uniform view of Hackney. Well, what Jerry has done is to try to get a single-person, unified view of an even bigger area, London. Not only this century, the 20th century, but also the 19th century too. And he's, at the moment, undertaking the 18th century. But Jerry perhaps is able to do that because he is a manager. As we know, he was once the chief executive of Hackney. He's now the local government ombudsman, based in Coventry. So he is not somebody who is remote from what's happening out there. Across his desk, and I know he also follows up many of these investigations in person, come a whole series of worries and anxieties and complaints about what's happening. But let's hear Jerry.
I remember chatting to a taxi driver many years ago who was taking me from the West End to Clapton, where I lived. And I must have got chatting to him about my pretensions to be a London historian, because he said to me, do you know, I bet you don't know, how Hackney got its name? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I think I do. It comes from, I understand, the Anglo-Saxon of an eot, or an island in a marsh, belonging to a man called Harkon. No, he said, it was nothing to do with that. It's all about when the knights in armour wanted to settle disputes, they went down to the marshes, and it was the hacking, he said, that gave Hackney its name. And I thought, and I've long remembered that, it just goes to show that Hackney is a place of many myths. And as a writer, I've always dealt in far more dull and sober stuff, and so I've been racking my brains to know what to speak about this afternoon. I've nothing to read of my own, because I've written very little about Hackney, and that's been largely incidental, as George says in these big books on modern London. So I thought I'd add something new to the multi-layered narratives of Hackney, and even maybe something to the myths, and talk a little bit about a single Hackney life, which is my own. I came to London from Dorset in 1970 at the age of 21, and worked as a public health inspector for Islington Council. These places resonate around us today. And in one form or another, as you've heard, I've been a local government bureaucrat ever since. You mustn't think, however, that it's all my fault. Around 1971, I married and lived in a converted flat in Casimir Road, Clapton, overlooking North Millfield, which is indeed one of Hackney's many surviving commons. I think that Hackney is possibly the richest in its commons heritage of any, certainly of the East London boroughs, certainly of the inner London boroughs. And I moved to a house in the same road some years after. Over the next 26 years or so, I lived in Clapton, Stamford Hill and Stoke Newington at 5 different addresses. Around 1973, while still in Clapton, I discovered what has been a lifelong obsession in the history of London, especially, I suppose, the history of the lives of ordinary Londoners and the poor. It was an obsession that relied on books for fuel, and by 1973 too, I'd run across Iain Sinclair, who was then a bookseller in Camden Passage. I didn't know him as a writer until some years later. I bought many wonderful titles from him, among them some I know he wishes he'd kept to himself, and even sold a few books to him. And if I remember right, his wife was a school teacher at the infant school where my sons first went to school.
Yes, that's right, absolutely, yeah.
My interests in history brought me into contact with Raphael Samuel and History Workshop. Raphael gets a mention in, or a few mentions in Ian's new book. And around 1979, or maybe 1980, I think I ran across Patrick Wright, who had submitted what I thought was a brilliant article to History Workshop Journal, about which not all the editors, of whom I was one, could agree, and we've been friends ever since. My connections with Hackney through the 1970s and just beyond were largely domestic and familial. I was not, for instance, anything like a Hackney historian. My historical work focused first on Spitalfields and then on Finsbury Park, the Islington part again, I'm afraid. Although I was a sort of hanger-on around Centerprise and the People's Autobiography of Hackney in the 1970s. I've been proud to call myself a friend of Ken Walpole, who again features in Ian's book, ever since. And I helped organise the East London History Workshop weekend conferences at Hoxton Hall in 1976 and 1977. To some extent, my connections were political, but at a low level. I was a relatively inactive member of the Hackney Labour Party for some years. I did some work for Shelter and the Child Poverty Action Group, inspecting council properties in South Hackney to evidence disrepair claims by the tenants. And I was a supporter of the Anti-Nazi League in their marches through Hoxton, I suppose in the mid to late 70s and early 80s, when fascism in London seemed to be capable of especially vicious resurgence. But my involvement in the borough became greatly enlarged and altered in 1984 when I was appointed Head of Environmental Health at the London Borough of Hackney. I left the Hackney Labour Party at the same time. It was a compromise I felt the citizens of Hackney shouldn't have to put up with. But my new job marked a much closer involvement with the borough and its people than any I'd had before. In 1984, Hackney Council was an extraordinary place at an extraordinary time. It was the half-willing victim, I summarise, of trade union-inspired anarchy. Filing in the Environmental Health Department was blacked in the elegant language of the time, and a room was filled with a year or more of paperwork stacked in piles on the floor. There were lockouts and occupations. I remember having to keep in the boot of my car a sort of the nucleus of an office in case we were locked out. I had to set up in some other council-run facility. The office tensions were such that I remember retching over the kitchen sink before I could face the daily torture. It was the worst time of my working life, just trying to bring some order to a public service on which many depended. Just how much one anecdote might show. Now, I've got a cockroach anecdote here, and we've all mentioned cockroaches and why this should be the case. Anyway, I'll let you have it even if you can't stand too many cockroaches. I remember I was in a meeting at the town hall. We had a weekly management team meeting. This was when I was still in the Environmental Health Department, and somebody came in to ask for me because a deputation of tenants from the Kingsmead estate had entered the town hall and refused to leave, and they were armed with jars of cockroaches, which they were threatening to release. Despite my best endeavours, I couldn't get them to go without promising to go down and see them, as soon as I left the town hall. We'd been carrying out, I was in charge of, my department had pest control as part of its responsibilities, and we'd been carrying out some treatments on the Kingsmead Road estate, Kingsmead estate, but the complications with the numbers of pests there meant that we had been treating first for Pharaoh's ants. Pharaoh's ants are tiny migrant creatures which infest kitchens in particular. And the science of it was that we had to get rid of the Pharaoh's ants before we could tackle the cockroaches. This was the way round. And I remember being shown into a flat in the Kingsmead Road estate where the infestation of cockroaches was as I had never seen in my life. This was it was a bright sunny day, and there were tens of thousands of German cockroaches, they're called. Blatella, tiny steam flies. You see them in ships and bakeries and that sort of place. There were tens of thousands over the walls, ceilings, doors, everything. I remember seeing them walking in and out of suitcases which had been left because the family who lived there had abandoned it to the cockroaches. And that afternoon I pulled the plug on the Pharaoh's ant treatment so we could begin to treat cockroaches on the Kingsmead estate. And I'd be surprised if they've all gone. No more cockroaches. 5 years later, in 1989, and despite knowing exactly what I was letting myself in for, I was appointed Chief Executive of the Council. Shortly after, with the demise of ILIA, I found myself at the head of some 15,000 staff. It was in many ways a more congenial job to me than running the environmental health and other services that I was doing before then, but by no means an easy one. Juggling local politics, always poisonous. I do hope they're less toxic now. And handling many vexed issues in the workforce took up much of the first 2 years. And it was in this period, I reckon, that I first met George Jones, and he came over to Hackney and I went over to the LSE to talk things over with him. But from around 1991, we were able to turn our gaze outwards, away from the preoccupations of the town hall to the needs of the borough, at least the needs as I and the politicians and officers around me understood them to be. Of course, others will have distinctly different opinions on that point. It was a privilege, I felt, to play some part in the City Challenge bid in Dalston, Kingsland and Hoxton, in the redevelopment of Holly Street and other estates, and particular enthusiasms, the establishment of Hackney Music Development Trust and a revamped Hackney Museum. Rightly or wrongly, these things seem to me the right things to do. Now, no doubt if I were there now, I'd be enthusiastically working away at Hackney's component of the Olympics bid. Whether we like it or not, Hackney, like the rest of London, will go on reinventing and transforming itself in ways that divide opinion. For some will lose and others will gain in any process of change, and it's often the locals who lose and the outsiders or newcomers who gain. It has, of course, always been that way, and one imagines always will. I left the council's employment in 1995 and moved away from Manor Road, Stoke Newington, which was my last Hackney address, and Hackney and London altogether in 1997. I've not been back much to Hackney, but I do occasionally, and I've donated my journals of life as chief executive to Hackney Archives. They're subject to a 30-year embargo to protect, as they say, the innocent.
Well, we've now got the rest of the time for comments, questions, discussion, argument from the floor. There are, I hope, roving mics, so if you want to ask a question, make a contribution. There's a contribution over there. It always helps on these occasions if you give your name and if you have any affiliation.
David Blue.
That's fine.
Anyway, at the end of the 19th century, was this marvellous book called Old and New London. It's 6 volumes, altogether it's 3,000 pages, each page 70 lines, 2 columns, 70 lines. It's about 5 or 8 or 10 times bigger than any other book about London, and I've never seen it mentioned. Obviously, I'm sure you all would know it very well, but it's never been mentioned in any newspaper about London, in a book review or anything else like that, and it's a total classic, because when they want to, they normally talk about crime, debauchery and scurrilous incidents, but when they, which is normal enough, but they can talk about them at length. They don't have some crazy editor just cutting every possible story down to the bone, so they can quote, if they talk, I live in Bury, so if they're quoting the Mint, which is where the bailiffs were not allowed to go, and then they can talk about Dickens and Pickwick Papers and Lat Street, and they can spend a page on that. Then they can talk about the bear baiting on the river. Talk about how men used to go down there with knives and challenge each other, in a blunt, prearranged, in effect, gladiatorial fights. And of course, there was the stand that collapsed, and 150 people died or got seriously injured. In Elephant Castle, there was the famous woman in the 19th century, very, very famous, who was like a holy woman. There's been several men like that, but she was the only holy woman in English.
Well, let's find out what's happened to those books.
Anyway, they ended up in the New Forest dancing naked in the forest.
Yeah, I think it's Walter Thornbury, I think, was the editor of them, and I think they are very good. And I certainly used them, and they're in my bibliography. It's only consolation. But yeah, very useful. And I didn't buy my copies from Iain.
You didn't, because I kept mine.
Oh, you've got. Well, I should think we all know them. You see, yeah, they're very good.
Yes, question here. Contribute. Second row.
Oh, hello, yes, I'm Robin Puttick. I've got a lot of connections with the East End, mostly with the rival South in Stepney, where I was fairly active in the squatting movement and the Bengali movement in the 70s. I'm actually was married for a number of years to Astrid Proll. I'm her English husband. And amongst other connections, and I think Jerry White, who said he worked at Islington Public Health, is that right? Yes, my father also worked there, probably at the same time.
Yes, of course. George
Puttick.
Yes. It's a very small world.
So anyway, I get to the question here. I'm just wondering, my own family also comes from the East End. A lot of my great-grandfather was a policeman looking for Jack the Ripper and so on in Stepney and Whitechapel. But I'm just wondering what you feel about Peter Ackroyd's concept of the spirit of place. Is there any continuity across all these events in the East End, or do you think it's just a tale told by an idiot where things just go from one thing to another randomly? That's
Well,
my question.
I think it's an interesting concept, Peter's one, but I think it's conservative in a sense that it holds the notion that change isn't really possible because certain areas, I think he describes time in a sort of vortex, slowing in certain Whitechapel, Wapping, whatever, that you cannot escape this sort of whirlpool of time where the same events come back time and again. And although that's an interesting conceit, I don't actually feel it myself to be true, although I do think there is this dense palimpsest of once you start digging on something you will uncover layer after layer, but you also have to be aware of the kind of shock waves that are coming in from the future, and that we spoke a lot about the notion of, Patrick was talking about the kind of notion of a divided city, and I think the enclosures that happen now with the Olympics are very similar to the enclosures that the poet John Clare would have known, the agricultural enclosures, which actually were part of a damaging psychological effect. And when they attempted these in Hackney itself, we heard about these commons as well that Hackney is so rich in. Hackney Downs was enclosed, but the local populace just ripped down the fences and helped themselves to the crops of the single person who was there. And Lammas lands had been fought for. But in another sense, I think it's very interesting too, that Ackroydian notion of recurrence. It was so amazing to hear you say that you had been Astrid Perel's husband, because one of the elements in this book was this sort of quest that ran through the book. That I knew that she had lived in the area, but I didn't know anything much about her myself, and discovered that every single person, almost every major person I'd known in terms of interviewing in the book, had known her and been part of her life in some way. So that this person who was ostensibly being searched for by kind of presumably the police forces of Europe was incredibly visible to everybody in Hackney except me. Even though she was a gardener also on London Fields at the end of the road where I live, and had lived in London Fields and had lived around Broadway Market also, and seemed now to have a kind of real affection for this area.
Yeah, no. On your question on the spirit of place issue and this thing, is it a tale told by an idiot? Well, I have to say my friend Iain is the idiot, really, because Peter Ackroyd got all that stuff from fleecing Ian's poems. You know, the whole business of the Hawksmoor triangulations and things. And you know, that book Hawksmoor he wrote is large tracts of it are just sort of lifted from Ian. I mean, it's an extraordinary operation, not just a sentence or an idea, pages. Now, what I would say about this is, I don't believe that, you know, there is a kind of malevolent curse built into the structure of the city that's removing people's choice or ability to determine. I don't buy this at all. What I do think is that this sort of strategy that Iain launched around the kind of idea of an enlightenment gone wrong was a brilliant way of dealing with what was going on at the end of the welfare state, you know, where ideas of post-war urban planning and all these things had sort of come to a kind of terrible, sticky, shuddering halt, which Margaret Thatcher then decided to really kick to death. And it seemed to me that the way that theory of East London became expressed in the 80s and 90s particularly was a very interesting reaction to the political reality of the times. And it was interesting to me that it came particularly from Iain, who was, in a sense, very careful not to say, I mean, you know, you could say that Iain comes from a kind of sensibility that is of the left in a way, but he was very uninterested in all those years that he was packing cigars and sort of doing gardening and all that stuff in East London. He was not going to join the SWP. I mean, you know, his politics was not of that kind. So it strikes me as very interesting that there's this sort of very, very strong analysis and symbolic resistance to what was going on at that time came from that quarter, not from, say, David Widgery, who we all liked, but who somehow was so busy trying to keep the politics intact that the question of how you apply it to reality was very closed down. So I don't believe in the curse in the ground, but I think the idea of the curse in the ground was very useful as a literary strategy.
Yeah, and also in a sense, if you write about the curse in the ground, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because there was a kind of literature generated around what Peter had done in the kind of Baroque or Gothic imagination, which then filtered through to people like Alan Moore, who created huge structures which have become hugely globally influential in terms of sort of cyberspace. It breathes like a virus, so that once you've stated that persuasively enough, it becomes a truth. In the way it was like, I was very interested in people like Hawking in the early days, when his work was, before it sort of emerged into the public stage, it was being very much discussed by poets like Jeremy Prynne in Cambridge, who had on his desk a huge series of calculations by Hawking on one side and a huge series of research papers from Charles Olson, the American poet, who believed absolutely in this sense of place. That you take one small town, Gloucester, Massachusetts, and from that you can open out by researching it to discover the whole world. And you start with particulars, facts, details, and it opens out into a cosmology. The kind of Ackroydian one, in a sense, was the opposite process. It was folding inward into a sense of the city is cursed, the city is doomed, the city is dark, and dark things are present now. And this is a sort of static theory, and the other one is incredible. And the Hawking notion was that if you have an elegant enough equation, then the proof will be discovered within the star system, that you do the structure first. And I feel this with writing, that if the writing is perfect and managed and absolutely right, then the kind of proofs follow. And so from the novels and poems of that period then evolved a kind of proof in that it's now reached the fact of being Hollywood movies, and epic structures have followed, which then themselves influence the thing so on that you can't escape it.
Now my eye has been caught over here, yes?
Well,
Okay. Yeah.
Can I just say, I don't buy the tragedy of the commons. This is a thesis which comes out of an extremely right-wing mindset, which says that the reason why the commons failed to operate as a form of social organisation is because if you let people have access to them, they over-exploit things and they all die. So the idea of the commons is that they had to be enclosed, because if you let the people use them, they're incapable of regulating themselves. They're all like cockroaches, to return to our metaphor, and just devour everything and the commons die. So I would reject the question of the tragedies of the common. I don't think it's a useful metaphor. And, I do think, basically the City Farm is a better example of a common than Tesco's, because, Tesco's operates in a model of consumerism, as we know, whereas the City Farm allows you to determine your relationship to it in a way that you can invent as you go along. It's not the only example, but the key point for me is abstract, that the commons are, it's a metaphor, it's very rich. It allows you to think of the common interest in a way that isn't just buried under concrete, which is what the political ideologies did to it.
There is a zone of commons that back off Victoria Park. There is a little common that runs into a zone on Wells Street, which is where the very first Tesco was ever built. By the original founder, who came in off the street. It actually shifted the whole operation inwards. That he had a street stall, stack them up high, sell them cheap, and this becomes a Tesco store. And the street market which fronted that store is now under threat and has in fact disappeared. But further down Morning Lane, a little further along, on the path of this mysterious Hackney Brook, which actually shaped the whole area, the geography and geology of the thing is the essence, coming back to the spirit of place, is why these villages grew up, why the grand houses were on the heights of Homerton, of which Sutton House is now the only survivor, which Pepys visited and so on, was simply because this river was flowing through. And the place where there were the wonderful watercress beds of Hackney is now this huge Tesco's. It's the Tesco's on Morning Lane. And is it a common? It is the kind of a common space in that it's the space of absolute collision. I'll just read a little paragraph about it. According to Anna, this is my wife, Tesco's car park between Mare Street and Morning Lane was the most aggressive and agitated site in the whole of Hackney, and there were plenty to choose from. It was a game reserve for which you had to be very game, up to speed and cranked and combat-hound, ready to beat off the professional beggars, the coin prospectors, the thieves, the peddlers of contraband DVDs, the confused, sad human relics, the unhoused madfolk, the rough sleepers, the shopping trolley chauffeurs who demanded the right to reclaim the pound you paid as security. They were lined up along the wall under the overhang of the roof, and they were part of the action, so that by carrying your bags or pushing your trolley or guarding your car, they achieved status. They were honorary consumers. They were like medieval vagrants. They were like barefoot pilgrims sheltering beside a great cathedral. The supermarket had a space platform glow. We're open 24 hours. A thorium luminescence like the lips of unfortunate women who spend their lives painting numbers onto watch dials. A terminal zone for tourists who will never leave town. Malformed pigeons, feathers the colour of sodden bog paper, mobbed the spiked Tesco sign, scratching their parasites on anti-bird spikes. The canted roof was sick with droppings. So, for me, this Tesco's car park is a kind of common of enormous interest, and also a kind of wilderness eco-zone. And Patrick has talked about how this the rhetoric of eco-politics kind of overwhelms all kinds of strange things. I thought the perfect example of this was on London Fields, where the council didn't really have the money to keep up or do anything with this particular stretch of London Fields. They didn't afford the gardeners anymore. So instead, they put in a series of notices banged into the ground and said, "This is a wilderness area." I thought that was like a perfect example of what happens. You do nothing, but you invent the spin to sell it. So in fact that you can no longer do anything, it gradually grows the grass. It becomes a wilderness area and a habitat for caterpillars and possibly unhoused cockroaches from the demolished tower block.
Now, my eyes caught over here.
Hi, my name is Nick Scammell. I've just actually completed I'm a photographer. I've just completed a project.
Can you speak a bit louder, please?
But, my name is Nick Scammell. I'm a photographer. I've just recently completed a documentary project on street life and around different parts of London. Hackney was part of it. My exhibition actually opens on Tuesday. If you want to come, it's on Hoxton Street, Macbeth Gallery. Anyway, my question was, it's actually for Iain. I wondered if you can confirm that you've actually been banned from promoting your book in Hackney's public libraries because of your lack of enthusiasm for the Olympics.
This is a really quite a strange episode and very lucky for me. What happened was, about a year or so ago, I did an event very like this. We were talking about Hackney writers in the Stoke Newington Library, and I was enthusiasing about Patrick's book, about Rain on the Pavement by Roland Camberton, and about the books of Alexander Bauer, and talking about a huge tradition of Hackney writing. And they asked me, because I said I was working on a Hackney book myself, to come back in a year's time and speak to a small group, probably 20 people in the Stoke Newington Library. And I agreed to do this, which was going to be, as it were, the launch for this book. And then, just before this was due to happen, the phone went, and the librarian rang up and said, "I'm sorry, we've had to withdraw your invitation to appear in Stoke Newington Library because we've been told by somebody at the council that you've written an article in the London Review of Books which was a bit off message about the Olympics, so we can no longer have you." And the librarians are not very happy about this because we really feel strongly that published authors should be encouraged into the local libraries to get other local writers going and show, and so on and so on. Well, I said, well, don't worry, I'm absolutely delighted with this because instead of 20 people, I'm sure this is going to cause furore. I was on the Today programme the next morning and so on, and the thing erupted into an enormous row because the things that people really feel aggrieved about losing are allotments and libraries. And the fact that it was emerged in the book that a lot of the library budget had actually been taken to install CCTV systems only heated this thing up. Well, then the council refused to appear and discuss or debate any of this and denied that it had anything whatsoever to do with the Olympics. They came up with a second position, which was, I can't be allowed into the library because libraries are not suitable for controversial subjects. For example, they said the two examples they gave was we couldn't have stem cell research or Afghanistan discussed in libraries. And I suppose neither could you discuss Hackney. Well, then there's a kind of wonderful local freedom sheet called the Hackney Citizen, and these people used the Freedom of Information Act and went back and looked at all the emails that had passed through from Hackney Council. And it went back that there was a directive from Jules Pipe, the mayor, which said this person cannot be allowed into a library. And it's because it's the Olympics. So the whole thing was a complete fabrication and a spin and a lie. And then there was a lot of local feeling that was aggrieved about the libraries and the use of libraries, and the council responded. And now they've been forced to kind of convene an event in a library which we're going to debate the Olympics. So the whole thing has turned this mad circle to end up with the very thing they didn't want, which I wasn't ever going to do. I would never have... I was going to talk about Hackney Wright. So, I mean, as PR, and this group, this is what disturbs me, is that you've actually created a kind of bureaucracy. We're not people like Jerry, who are actually dealing with cockroaches or environment or anything else, but a kind of category of spinner, which are an enormous number on sort of salaries of 50,000 a year, just managing news and just actually doing nothing practical or useful, but trying to make things seem better than they are. And it is disturbing, and it is annoying.
There's a silver-haired gentleman caught my eye first, and then after that the lady, and after that the gentleman with the beard.
Thank you for the silvered hair bit. I live in Hackney. No shouts of horror. I just wanted to... by the way, there are a lot of LSE students here. It's a good place to be in Hackney because you've got 3 buses which you can take down, 2 of which will land you at the door of LSE, and they do it quite quickly. So it has some characteristics. I know I don't write about London, as the panel does, although I'd like to. But I find... we moved into Hackney only 15 years ago, and out of Islington, by the way. Islington was such a terrible place at that time, and there was a council almost as good as the one that was being described in Hackney a little while ago. But the great characteristic for Hackney, for me, is that it is so different in so many ways. It's not different. I don't mean it. I mean itself. If you walk up as we do about it all the time, it's got so many different things that represent London or are particular and different. And certainly, Iain's books, and the way he approaches this thing, it's a place where you really feel there's things in life happening and it's changing, and you don't know what will be around the next corner, whether it's one of those posters that people were illustrated up there. It's just very full of life. And I think it is a there, but it's a there of many different things. And they don't add together into a neat parcel. Thank God. I mean, the boroughs in London that are neatly tied up and beautiful are really empty. You can't say that about Hackney. It's never empty. There's always something that you'll fall across, even if it's dog shit.
Thank you.
Can I just quickly agree with you, but also I'd like to say that given that so much sort of negativity has been around Hackney, even to this day, in its general popular press profile, I always feel obliged to tell people who aren't Londoners that Hackney is a place where people spend an inordinate amount of time not mugging and raping one another. You do have to sort of spell that out to some people quite severely.
Yep.
Hi. My question is to Iain Sinclair. Could you please elaborate a bit what is the argument with the Olympic project in relation with Hackney?
Sorry, the argument with what?
With the Olympic project in relation with Hackney.
My argument with the Olympic project?
Yes, because it seems to me that sometimes, you have been told about this, and you have been said a lot of things that it's about to build fences that stop the cosmology of Hackney, or I don't know, what is the discussion?
Well, I mean, it's a huge subject, really, but my basic argument with the Olympic project is that it's nothing to do with the Olympics. The Olympic project is actually about creating a huge shopping mall. An Australian developer has got this mall called Westfield, which one example is now in Shepherd's Bush. The other example is going to appear in Stratford. It's massive. And a whole series of other particular developments were going to go on there, which were going to happen anyway, but the notion of the Olympics brought in is simply a way, a kind of smokescreen of pushing the thing through very fast and siphoning off whole tranches of government money. It's kind of Olympics could have been held rather like these wonderful Olympics that London had after the war in 1948. They had what was sort of known as the austerity Olympics, in which you more or less used anything that was there, Nissen huts, and people lived in just boarded in people's houses. You used the facilities that were in the city anyway, made the best of it. Kind of people gathered from all over the place and had these games that were rather extraordinary and very ad hoc and curious. Now, it's a massive, huge global development. The sponsors, we're given the statistics of sponsorship. Coca-Cola, Lloyds Bank, who are collapsing. McDonald's are going to provide the food. The loss has been enormous. And at the end of the day, what is now the pitch that they've come up with? Because the whole notion was that private developers would come in and provide a lot of the money, and that it would sort of be a partnership. Well, all of the private developers, bit by bit, are withdrawing. They're going. So, in fact, we are going to be picking up this enormous, massive debt, which we can't afford. We're in an enormous hole and we're still digging. It's a kind of apocalyptic disaster. The materials, the radioactive materials from these dirty and dangerous industries that were on the site were relatively inert. There was a luminous watch dial factory, and they dumped the toxic material in the cesspits of an estate that was called Clay's Lane. While they were lying down there in the ground untouched, nothing was happening. They were relatively inert. But of course, having to do this huge building project so rapidly meant that the thorium from this radioactive site has now leaked into the water table, which is actually radioactive. I mean, you cannot do things very fast. It's an extraordinary and insane development that actually is going to end up with something that's going to be presented back to the people of London as a people's park. Well, what was there originally? What was there before this started? It was actually an untamed people's park. It was a zone of allotments. It was an extraordinary community that existed in Clay's Lane. A lot of students were there. A lot of people that didn't mind living in this strange edgeland had formed a community that was actually exactly the kind of community you try and engender, where the people cared for each other. They had communal meetings, and they were dispersed to the four winds. They were told they'd be kept together, but they weren't. They were dispersed. The travellers' camps are gone. A kind of extraordinary collaged wilderness area on the edge of everything was destroyed and overnight for something which I don't think is particularly English. It's a sort of a global phenomenon, a kind of capitalist feast in which your chemists compete with our chemists to see who can win the most medals, which is a kind of industrial process. And I don't think that's particularly worth the price it's costing.
Yes, I can see we're getting controversial. Now, there's one final question. I must come to a conclusion, so we'll have a question, please. I know you've had your hand up for some time. Oh, well, there's two of you.
Two final questions.
Well, go on, two quick questions.
So just speak a bit louder, because I can't hear at least.
I'll do my question, maybe. Okay, Jane Bartlett, Hackney resident for the last 19 years. So, Iain and the panel, I have to ask, what do you feel about the announcement in the Evening Standard 2 days ago that Jules Pipe might be standing for London Mayor, which would mean that he can actually apply his experience of running Hackney for the last 8 years, London-wide?
Well, the great thing now, I think I heard that, was it's about Jules Pipe applying to be London Mayor. Yeah, well, this is, again, I started by talking about the money metaphor having collapsed. And this is another metaphor of a kind of celebrity culture. It's like the whole of politics becomes this game show. And Boris Johnson obviously auditioned very successfully on Have I Got News for You, and proved that he could be this sort of a Woosterish figure that was also known to be very intelligent and a classicist despite it all. And he, therefore, becomes London Mayor. And, Arnold Schwarzenegger is governor. The whole thing becomes an extraordinary construction, which is like a kind of form of a desperate TV show. It's another Second Life. And so in that sense, Jules Pipe is a perfect candidate, but a perfect candidate to fail. Because most of the newspaper hoardings I saw as I walked down the road here were saying Alan Sugar for mayor, because he's got a more popular TV programme. He's a Hackney figure, of course. He grew up in Hackney and endlessly boasts about his humble beginnings in Hackney and cooking up kind of vegetable oils on a Saturday morning. So he's an absolutely key image. A guy whose sort of businesses failed and became disastrous, who reinvents himself as a TV growler and is now going to be Mayor of London. Perfect.
Yep.
Got it working now. My name's Jackie. I used to live in Newington Green on Fern Tower Road, actually, and my happiest years of my life were there, and it was a very special place. Here I'm a PhD student, and I'm writing about policing in Jakarta, and I really resonated with what Patrick and Iain were saying about the difficulties of representing place. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind giving a few words, a sort of forensic autopsy of how you dealt with the information that you received and how you structured it and grouped it, and what sorts of decisions did you struggle over in doing that?
Patrick?
Well, for me, I mean, the issue for me was that I think I'm about as, I'm not entirely short of self-regard, but I nevertheless found writing about Hackney quite challenging, because the reality of the place simply keeps sort of either disrupting or outperforming my own sentences. That's what I remember feeling when I was writing about it. And what I feel is that to understand, one of the things that makes me very cross with sort of conventional literary writing, I mean, when I wrote that book, Journey Through Ruins, I was vehemently hostile to all ideas of travel writing written by British people, because it seemed to me that the world was full of these guys who would get a little degree somewhere and they would sort of realize they wanted to be writers. Well, I think the world's divided between people who want to be something and people who want to do something, and doing something is a better way to go. So I've never had this desire to be a writer. I am praising myself a bit, forgive me. But the point about travel writers is they fly off to somewhere exotic in order to make themselves exotic. So you end up with perceptions that would be utterly banal and insulting if you expressed them in your own country. And because you're in St. Helena and you've just been up the mountain in a donkey and you've formed an amorous relationship with somebody who you've never met, all this nonsense. You end up with that, and that's what travel was. Now, for me, the issue was I can't do a summary of what this place means. I can't collapse it all into my view of it. So I'm going to do travelling for people without air tickets. That's how I thought of those books. And I thought I would just use geography as a way of getting over the shortcomings of my approach, but also confronting myself with new things that I had to think about. So I used movement as an alternative to order in the making of that book. And the last thing I'd say is that I also believe that you can't write about a modern experience or reality, in my judgment, without having an archive. No piece of writing that doesn't have an archive at the moment seems to me to have a chance of commanding the reality we're in. You've got to be able to understand, you've got to be able to use the archive, not like a historian does for evidence to support your already stated position, but to disrupt yourself and to open questions that seem boring, to make things interesting, to keep yourself awake in the morning, to understand how the world got to be the way it is. So my view of this world where we live in fiction or non-fiction, this is the booksellers' division, it's nonsense. I mean, modern experience demands forms of prose that are both involved in research, which are, may take you into university libraries, and which also operate on the street. So I think what we're all looking for in one way or another is that form of prose. And I think in this country, I mean, Iain and I have been involved, we've sort of been talking about these things on and off for a long time, and I don't know how well we've done. But I think basically I'm pleased to think that Hackney has played quite a part in sort of doing that. I mean, we're not all writing Hampstead novels, and not that long ago we were, and indeed some people still are. Okay, thank you.
Jerry?
Well, my project is very different, I think, to both Patrick and Iain's, but it seems to involve endless note-taking. That's what I do. And I get my notes from published sources. I'm writing on the 18th century now. Published sources from the 18th century and since, from newspapers, from manuscript letters and diaries, anything I can get my hands on that some other person hasn't used. That's what I most value, because the 18th century, the history of 18th century London has been crawled over in the most minute detail. I find myself stumbling across something which I think I've discovered for myself, and then find that two people have written books about it in the last 10 years. The other thing I think that what a historian has to be good at is filing. You need to be, all my notes are in longhand, and you need to be very sure where your notes are kept, about which subject they are, and when you begin to plan the book, you can then have at your fingertip, this is the ideal theory, the notes that you then need to make that chapter or that section of a chapter work. So it's a very grounded and sort of, I grub around in the archives for bits and pieces. That's all I can describe it as.
Iain, our final contribution.
Yeah, well, even before I was banned from libraries, I was never kind of comfortable with libraries. I remember I went to university in Dublin, and you had to go through some particular ceremony and turn up in your gown and make some statement in Latin to be allowed in. And I didn't actually have a gown. I wasn't that kind of involved with it, and my Latin was pretty rough, so I never actually made this formal thing, and so we're never really allowed to use the library. And my library then, by default, became the street, and I became expert at kind of picking up strange scraps from junk shops and listening to stories that someone would tell in a pub, and so moving on to Hackney and then becoming a gardener down in Limehouse, the period I wrote this Hawksmoor church stuff, I started, like Jerry, to keep notebooks. It was all in a notebook. The advantage being that I could never read my own writing. So having got the notebook, I then had to start inventing and kind of using the gesture just as a sort of mnemonic or prompt, and also taking a lot of photographs. So photographs became my real journal. And I found that actually looking at an image of something would be so provocative that I wouldn't need to have had a written note of any sort at all, apart from an occasional bit of fact. And in Hackney, I think rather than me discovering how I could write about Hackney, I think if you stay there long enough, the place writes you. You don't have any existence other than this. John Clare, who I mentioned before, when he was a child of about 7, he lived in a village in which the horizon of that village was everything he knew. He believed it was a kind of eye, and that he was surveyed whenever he was there. So if he wanted to do anything, he had to hide himself away, go into woods. And one day, as a young child, he walked what he calls out of his knowledge. He walked beyond the bit that he knew very well. And when he'd got there, he realized this was incredibly challenging, because now the flowers, the birds, the trees, all of those things didn't know him. The other ones around the village did. Therefore, he had an existence. Once he'd gone out of his knowledge, he didn't exist. He wasn't himself. And he had to write himself back into existence. I think that's been the process for me with Hackney. To always push into a bit that I don't know, and therefore don't know myself, don't know what the story is, wait for a narrative to form. And in this particular book that I've just done for the first time, I started to Ken Warpel was mentioned, who was an expert at oral histories. I started to listen a lot to other people and take down and construct long monologues out of what they told me. And therefore the sense of place changed completely, and therefore the book had a double structure and a kind of multi-voice structure for which the narrative presence at the centre is not dominant. I mean, in the end you become a kind of editor of material rather than the conceiver and constructor of it.
Well, we've overrun because it was so important and interesting. I'll just say that outside, afterwards, there will be some book signing. Books, as you've seen, are on sale, and the authors are here and are very happy to sign. My final reflection is that aren't great writers also great talkers? We've heard some superb talk this afternoon, and let's all just say thank you to our three authors.